All right, UVs. So last week we spent a little bit of time generating new 3D meshes to rebuild a church, and the main focus was working to the power of 2, as well as snapping to the grid to ensure ease when we're level building. And within that, we also covered making sure that we have pivot points on our meshes set up to the same point. So as you can see here, as I'm selecting them all, barring the current asset, they're all front, bottom, left. I've set my pivot points, so when I'm snapping to the grid, they're all anchored to the same place, and they should all sync up. But this week we want to focus on actually rendering out these assets and making them look like a real world church. Oh, excuse me. So when we were children, we were introduced to the concept of shape nets, which was when we started off with a little 2D printout of a cube, and we had to fold it and glue it back together to make a 3D shape. It was magical. So here we've got the 2D view and the 3D view. So I just went to the UV editor to load this up, and we can see here that the 3D faces are all accurately represented in the 2D view, and as I bounce around selecting it in the 3D view or the 2D view, the two are in sync. But what's important to kind of bear in mind here is we're looking to unfold our 3D meshes in a way that preserves the proportions of faces, so that when it comes to assigning a texture to this UV coordinate, the pixels are being assigned to the face in a way which don't stretch those pixels out, making it look horrendous. So for example, if I was to assign a material to this face, we'll just assign a grounding noise. Okay, and I'm just going to press 6 to turn on texture visibility. It's a little bit, that's a rubbish texture to use. My bad. Let's quickly choose another one. Fractal. There we go. Okay, so we've got a nice, clear, high contrast image. So in the UV editor, if I hover over the face that has a texture on it, we can see which one is responsible for reading this, and we can see this landmark is clearly represented as being right here in that texture. Okay, and if we was to go in and start modifying these UVs, as it's trying to squeeze in more pixels from this 2D image, so it's just a way of mapping your 2D textures into 3D space. So when we start getting incorrect proportions, what happens is what we're trying to do is, if we stretch this out so the entire face was too rectangular, everything becomes stretched and distorted. However, if it's all nice and proportioned, it's beautiful. Getting rid of that example, we're going to UV this piece of wall. We've got two different approaches we're going to use. The first one is a little bit dated, but it still communicates the essence of UV mapping. The first method is the planar mapping approach, where we need to turn this tangled mess up into a more accurate representation of the proportions here in this view, as well as isolate it into chunks which make sense. So planar projection, it works by taking a snapshot of your model from a single perspective, and in this case we're making a selection to limit what it's taking a snapshot of, because if we were to just select the entire object, go to UV and planar and change it to the Z axis, we're going to get, oh, I made a mistake. So if we go back in planar and we turn on keep image width and height, it's going to preserve the dimensions of our mesh, and we can see here we've already got a massively improved representation of the front of the model. However, if we hover over face mode and make a selection along the top, we can see that the faces along the top, or those inside the window, have not been captured at all, because the way Planar works is it's looking at that single axis. So in this case, it's looking down the z-axis. And if you imagine the camera being positioned at the end of the arrow coming off the move tool, and it's pointing towards the center where the axes intersect in the center, we need to make sure that we're selecting all the faces which point towards the axes really cleanly and directly. So if I make that selection, UV, Planar again, make sure it's still on Z, we've got keep image width and height ratio, and now we've got a clean map of the front of the building. We'll move that out of the way. If we go to the top, we'll shift click at the end to grab it all. UV, Planar, and this time the axes which look straight through those faces will be the Y. So change that to Y and apply. Then I'm just using the move tool to move my islands around, or my shells. And then again, we're going to end up on the Z axis. But this one is going to end up facing, in terms of where the camera's shooting from, it's going to be hitting the back of these faces. So we're going to need to reverse these faces. So we're still going to go into Planar, change it to Z, and apply. Now we've got those. What we need to do is modify and flip. Just double checking quickly. Yeah, flip. We're going to do it horizontal first and then vertical. So now these faces, oh, I did one too many. So we're just going to go back in and flip horizontal. We'll know when we go right, because if we change the selection mode to edges, as we hover over edges, it will show you the brother-sister relationship between edges. So selecting this right hand side and shift selecting all the way along. If I go to move and sew, I can stitch those islands back together. If I do the same along the top, hopefully it will do the same. Move and sew. It did, yeah. So now we've just got this little island inside, which is not likely to work very well with planar projections, because these faces in particular are facing away from the axes. Although they're facing towards the Z, the blue arrow, they're also stretching off into the axis, so we wouldn't get a very accurate reading of these. And the same for the Y, because there's movement in the Y axis, we wouldn't capture the full proportion of those faces. So for that reason, the planar projection can get us pretty far. However, we may want to experiment with a different method. So the planar projection is lovely. It's really good for simple meshes like walls, but it hinges on faces pointing towards an axis really cleanly. If we go to this mesh, we're going to use a new tool called 3D Cut and Sew tool. And actually, before I do this, I want to get really clean information on this, so it's all just one set of UV islands. So we're going to get UV and camera based. There we go. So these bold white lines around the edge are the boundaries for my UV islands. And what we're going to do is we're going to generate new ones as we go around this mesh, and we're going to let the software do all the heavy lifting for us. So with the mesh selected, we're going to go to UV, 3D Cut and Sew. Now if I hold tab, yeah, there we go, tab, it will allow me to left click on the mesh and draw new boundaries for where I want edge UV islands to be cut. So we're trying to break it up into nice clean sections where all the faces are pointing in a similar direction, or they should flow onto each other. So in this case, I think I'll set the island to here. It is a little bit of trial and error, and as I establish start and end points for an island, it will color code it so you've got clean visual feedback on what's fitting together. I'm going to split this off as well. This one, I think there's quite a clear change in direction for the inside of the window, so I'll break that off into its own chunk as well. And also if I was to UV this as it's right, so all I've done so far is I've held down the tab key and I've left clicked on my model to draw out cuts in the UVs along edges or edge loops. If I now press hold down right click, I'm going to component mode, UV shell, I can select faces, and if I press D on the right hand side, our UVs are going to update. Okay, so that one's been separated, and hold D again, and so I'm just selecting each UV section and pressing D on the keyboard, and we can see changes happening over here. It's a little bit messy, but in a second all will become clear. So pressing D once more. Okay, and now finally, if we change our tool back to a default tool and put this in object mode, we've got the mesh selected, and we go to modify and layout. We can see it's straight away it's separated all of our UV islands or segments into really clearly recognizable faces. And the last step would be to go with modify and orient shells. So they've now been made really clean facing. Modify layout again. There we go. So in the space of a few clicks, we've managed to unfold a relatively complex shape. Though looking at this, the fronts come out good, the backs, well, the front, the back, and the top have come out great. Though the inside of the window is really terrible. That's not a very clean representation of the asset I've created. And I think that's because we've got a U shape here around the bottom and middle of the window, which is quite straight. But then this curving shape up here has added a little bit of information which it hasn't processed very well. So if we go back in, we're going to select the cut and sew tool again, and we're just going to hold down component edge mode. We're going to left click. If we press X and click, so we're holding down X on the keyboard and clicking on the edge, so we've now drawn a boundary between the top half and the bottom half. It hasn't changed color, which is worrying, but we're going to quickly try and, yep, there we go. So we have got a unique selection. We're going to reselect the top, we'll press D again, so it's torn that off, and it looks like a much cleaner shape. And now we're going to grab the bottom as well, press D again, and that's come out as a beautiful shape. And we're just going to go through that process again of modify, layout, modify, orient shells, so that we're aligning them relatively okay. And now we've got a set of faces which are looking relatively good. Layout once more, now that they're snapped straight. Unfold, layout. There we go. Okay, the only other thing we need to really worry about is making sure we leave a little bit of padding between our UV islands, so that when it comes to generating textures, whether it's in Photoshop or through Maya's transfer map features, we're not leaving too small a gap that we end up with pixel bleeding, creating issues for us. So this one's going outside of the UV coordinates, outside these nice bold lines. And there's no way to really fit it in without overlapping other faces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly rotate this around, and by doing this, not only does it now fit within this UV space, but it's also facing the same it's oriented in the same direction as these faces below, which means that the texture is not going to be kind of changing directions between these two components. It's going to be consistent. There's still a few little issues here, such as these UVs not being entirely straight. So I could select them and go to modify and straighten UVs. There we go, beautiful. Yeah, so I think to make these fit, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this away, and I move these to be rotated around. So I mean, UVing, it's not overly complex. It is just a case of making sure you're using the space as well as you can. Modify and rotate. There we go. There we go. We've got loads of space in between where we could put other assets. Fantastic.